Some moments are powerful enough to shatter the rhythm of your life with a single whisper. And sometimes, that whisper comes from a queen, bold enough to slip into your room, close enough to make your heart skip a beat. The hum of the orbital station Aurelia 7 was a low, constant vibration that threaded through every bulkhead, every corridor, and even the recycled air that slipped past the man's nostrils. Lieutenant Marcus Vale had been aboard for 3 months, long enough to know which maintenance bots were likely to collide with the hydroponic gardens, which airlocks had a tendency to jam when humidity spiked, and which senior officers would groan if he asked a question that was obviously written in the operational manual. His life was rhythmically mundane, measured in sensor readings, report submissions, and the occasional frustrated outburst when a drone decided to play tag with the ceiling panels. The only exception had been his fondness for staring out the observation deck at the gas giants that swirled below the station, a swirl of sapphire and emerald that reminded him, absurdly, of melted candies. But that quiet comfort was about to shatter in a way he couldn't have predicted, even if he had been an expert in predicting orbital collisions. The Queen of the Verdani was coming. Not visiting for a ceremony, or making a formal inspection, or any of the euphemisms his mind might conjure to soften the blow. No, she was coming, period, with the unmistakable air of intention that left no room for negotiation. He had seen the Verdani in the protocols. Tall, graceful, long ears that tapered like wind instruments, and a ceremonial regalia that could make even the most experienced diplomat quiver. But the Queen herself was a different presence entirely. She was said to have green skin that shimmered softly under light, blonde hair that cascaded like sunlight through floating leaves, and eyes sharp enough to catch lies before they were even spoken. Marcus had studied the reports meticulously, memorized the protocols, and even rehearsed a formal greeting in the mirror. Though, to be honest, he looked ridiculous, practicing a bow that required him to pretend his knees weren't already complaining. Then came the whisper. He had been walking through the central atrium, clipboard in hand, muttering complaints about a wayward gravity stabilizer when she appeared. She glided across the corridor, her long ears brushing the subtle hum of the force fields, and her presence made the entire space feel wrong. Not dangerous, exactly, but wrong in the way that a perfectly aligned star suddenly flickers out of place. She leaned slightly toward him, close enough for her warm breath to brush his cheek, and in a voice that was silk and steel all at once, she said, "I'll come to your room tonight." Time stuttered. The clipboard rattled in his hands. A maintenance bot zipped by and bumped into a floating toolbox, sending a spray of magnetic screws into the air. One ricocheted off the ceiling, pirouetted, and lodged neatly in the seam of his boot. Marcus froze, convinced the universe was mocking him. He blinked. She blinked. The long, elegant tips of her ears twitched, almost as if acknowledging that, yes, he had just had a minor public humiliation. His first thought was, of course, procedural. Do not faint, do not scream, do not accidentally insult a monarch. His second thought was purely human. Holy gravity wells, she's actually coming to my room. And the third thought, inevitably, was slightly ridiculous. I hope she likes instant noodles. The day dragged itself out. A blur of misfired drones, awkward glances, and Marcus desperately trying to act as if nothing unusual had occurred. Every interaction with colleagues became a potential comedic trap. When Lieutenant Perrault asked if he had finished the supply manifest, he responded with a distracted, "Yes, I think, or maybe no," and nearly tripped over his own feet, catching himself in a panicked roll that left him seated on the floor like a clumsy child at a tea party. Perrault raised an eyebrow. "You look enlightened," she said dryly, and Marcus wanted to shout, "No, I'm terrified, not enlightened," but instead mumbled something incoherent about gravimetric anomalies. By midday, Marcus had developed a strange mixture of paranoia and absurd optimism. Every noise, a low rumble, a clank, a distant echo of a bot's sensors, was potentially the Queen arriving ahead of schedule. He even went so far as to triple-check the environmental settings in his quarters, ensuring the lights were soft but flattering, the temperature comfortably warm, and the air ionized in a way that minimized the faint odor of recycled station food. He debated whether or not to open a bottle of Terran wine, finally deciding that if she refused, he would simply cry quietly into it later. Meanwhile, rumors circulated among the junior staff, who were blissfully unaware of the whispered promise. One of them mentioned over lunch that the Queen had a reputation for being merciless in protocol and delightfully unpredictable in private. Marcus, who was pouring a cup of synthetic coffee, nearly choked, sending a thin stream of bitter liquid onto the floor. A nearby bot, sensing the spill, attempted to mop it up and ended up knocking over a tray of snack packs, which cascaded like a metallic waterfall. Marcus waved at it helplessly. "No, I said asterisk quietly unpredictable," he muttered. The bot seemed unimpressed. When evening finally arrived, the corridors had emptied, leaving only the soft hiss of airlocks and the occasional hum of a power conduit. Marcus checked his reflection in the polished alloy panel of his door. His hair was sticking up in odd angles, his uniform wrinkled, and his eyes probably looked like he had been awake for 62 hours straight, which, in a sense, he had been. He practiced a casual posture, hoping to convey nonchalance, but accidentally stepped on the corner of a rug, sliding across the floor with the grace of a deranged hoverbot. He ended up flat on his back, staring at the ceiling lights with a strangled exclamation in his throat, and imagined that this would be his legacy if the Queen walked in now. The man who fell over his own feet while awaiting an alien monarch. The knock on the door came like a carefully orchestrated chord, startling him enough to send a small stack of manuals tumbling to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, attempting dignity while simultaneously realizing that dignity and panic were incompatible roommates. The door opened slowly, and there she was. The Queen, green skin luminous under the soft lighting, blonde hair catching the ambient glows, long ears flicking attentively as she stepped inside. She smiled, not cruelly, not mockingly, but with a subtle warmth that made his heart thump with the rhythm of a misaligned graviton. "Lieutenant Vale," she said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of her people, "you look comfortable." He opened his mouth, intending some witty, charming retort. Nothing came out that made sense. Instead, he tripped over the corner of his own rug again, his hands flailing, and nearly fell backward into a hollow projector that projected a looping image of a Verdani ceremony he had been analyzing earlier. She raised an eyebrow, one long ear flicking like a tuning fork, and Marcus realized he had just performed a full slapstick routine for the queen of an alien civilization. To his astonishment, she laughed, a sound like wind over crystal chimes, and it was the first time anyone had ever made him feel like his incompetence might actually be endearing. The moment shifted, subtle and powerful. The air hummed, the station itself seemed to pause, and a connection formed in the space between panic and laughter, between alien elegance and human absurdity. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name, but Marcus, slipping a hand over a stray strand of his own hair and hoping he didn't faint from the sudden closeness, realized with a mixture of terror and delight that his life aboard Aurelia 7 would never, ever be the same. They spoke then, slowly, deliberately, exchanging small anecdotes about the quirks of their respective worlds. The Queen recounted the absurdity of Verdani etiquette, how one could accidentally insult an entire family by misaligning a ceremonial leaf. Marcus replied with tales of Terran office mishaps, from staplers that refused to staple to automated coffee machines that refused to brew. Laughter bridged the immense gap between their species, softening the weight of protocol and expectation. Each chuckle, each shared glance, pulled them closer into a strange orbit of mutual fascination and gentle, teasing connection. By the time the conversation waned, Marcus felt both exhausted and exhilarated. His room was still a mess. The hollow projector flickered with ceremonial imagery, and he had tripped over at least 3 pieces of furniture. Yet in the corner of his mind, a single, thrilling thought remained. She had come, she had spoken to him, and somewhere in the soft glow of the station lights, a human and an alien had begun to orbit one another in a quiet, tentative dance that defied rules, reason, and expectation. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And it was, undeniably, ridiculously funny. Marcus had spent the better part of the next morning recovering from what he privately called the Queen incident. Recovery, in his case, meant a combination of pacing in his quarters, carefully measuring the number of times he tripped over his own feet, and avoiding the gaze of any maintenance bots that seemed to possess a malicious sense of timing. He had learned, during the quiet moments when the orbital station hummed with its habitual low-frequency pulse, that even the smallest error could ripple into a comedic disaster. A loose panel in the corridor had already led to a bot's minor rebellion the day before, which he still feared would somehow escalate in the presence of the Queen's scrutiny. By mid-morning, however, duty called, and Marcus had no choice but to resume his rounds. The station felt subtly altered, as though the quantum filaments that carried information between the structural layers had sensed the change in his orbit. It was impossible to explain, but Marcus found himself glancing at the observation deck far more often than usual, imagining the green-skinned Queen walking across the bridge, her long ears twitching as they absorbed every nuance of sound and movement. He told himself sternly that it was entirely professional curiosity. Yet the more he tried to focus on gravimetric sensor calibrations, the more his mind wandered to the image of her entering his quarters the night before, a faint smile playing across her lips as he toppled over the hollow projector. The thought made him grin sheepishly, despite the professional hazards of grinning in public. Even the corridors seemed to have a sense of timing that morning. A stray cleaning drone buzzed past, bumping into a corner and releasing a cloud of harmless but irritating disinfectant mist. Marcus waved at it frantically, slipping slightly on the slick floor, and muttered, "If I survive today without embarrassing myself again, it will be a minor miracle." In the corner of his peripheral vision, he caught another bot attempting to haul a stack of cargo crates, only to collide with a bulkhead, sending the crates sliding in an elegantly catastrophic domino effect. He ducked just in time, only to realize he had landed directly in the path of a low-gravity maintenance sphere, which floated gently against his chest, bouncing off and sending him sprawling onto the floor again. Somewhere in the distance, a technician chuckled over a comlink, clearly relishing Marcus's slapstick routine. By late afternoon, Marcus had received the subtle memo that the Queen's personal emissary would accompany her for a follow-up visit. He spent the remainder of the day preparing, though preparing in his case was more of a frantic attempt to create an illusion of competence. His quarters had been straightened, the lights adjusted to a warm, flattering hue, and a small stack of Terran novels set conspicuously on a table in case she wished to discuss Earth literature. He debated whether to set out snacks, but quickly realized that Verdani physiology made Terran food a potentially hazardous offering. One misstep with a packet of dehydrated noodles could have catastrophic consequences. He muttered to himself, "If she laughs at me again, I'll call it a cultural exchange." When the announcement came that she had arrived, Marcus's nerves coiled like magnetic filaments in the energy conduits above the corridors. He took a deep breath, only to realize he had forgotten to check the pressure in the air filtration module. Adjusting, it triggered a soft whistling sound, perfectly timed with the Queen's entry, which made it seem as though the station itself was sighing in anticipation. She entered with her usual grace, green skin luminous under the artificial lighting, blonde hair catching the reflections of the ambient panels, and ears that twitched like twin sensors calibrated to the subtlest shifts in tone. "Lieutenant Vale," she said, her voice carrying a musical cadence that seemed almost playful. "You appear industrious today." Marcus bowed awkwardly, nearly catching his shoulder on a holographic display that flickered to life at the wrong moment, projecting a loop of a Verdani ceremonial garden. He muttered, "I do my best to maintain operational excellence," and immediately regretted it, realizing that sounded far too formal for the tone she had set with her smile. They settled into the small sitting area of his quarters, and conversation began in a tentative, winding path. She spoke first of Verdani customs, explaining the humor hidden in rituals that outsiders always misinterpreted as solemn. One involved a ceremonial leaf, a precise tilt of the head, and the careful timing of a long exhale, which could accidentally insult an entire family if done incorrectly. Marcus attempted to follow along, nodding, only to realize that he was mentally trying to diagram the ritual with schematics of station airflow. The Queen noticed and laughed softly, a sound that made the circuits in his chest feel oddly warm. In response, Marcus told her about Terran office mishaps, from misbehaving printers to malfunctioning coffee machines that seemed to conspire against human logic. He demonstrated the sequence of events with exaggerated gestures, culminating in a comic slip on an imagined puddle of spilled coffee. She laughed again, long ears flicking with amusement, and for a moment Marcus could swear she was actually enjoying the absurdity of human incompetence. As the conversation deepened, humor gave way to curiosity, curiosity to fascination. The Queen leaned forward, resting her delicate fingers on the edge of the table, and asked questions about his world. The stations, the orbital dynamics, the way humans managed to live in such tight quarters with such fragile temperaments. Marcus responded with a mix of technical explanation and anecdotal humor, making her chuckle at the idea that humans could survive endless bureaucratic tangles with only mild chaos as collateral. At one point, a maintenance bot wandered in, its sensors misinterpreting their conversation as a request for assistance. It began projecting a holographic image of Marcus, mid-fall from one of his earlier mishaps, overlaying it with celebratory confetti. The Queen raised an eyebrow, and Marcus groaned, realizing that even technology seemed to be in on the joke. "It appears the station has a sense of humor," he said, waving at the bot, which beeped in what he assumed was agreement. They spent hours discussing politics, energy manipulation, and interstellar diplomacy, but always through a lens that allowed for levity. She described the Verdani's mastery of energy fields with elegant analogies, likening them to ribbons of light dancing across the void. Marcus shared his clumsy experiments with gravity modulators, including the time he accidentally caused a zero-gravity coffee spill that almost short-circuited an entire corridor. Each story, each laugh, drew them closer, creating a rhythm of dialogue that was playful yet intimate, bridging the chasm between their species. As night deepened, the Queen moved closer to the observation panel, gazing out at the swirling planetary clouds below. Marcus joined her, leaning against the console awkwardly, still flustered but no longer terrified. She pointed out the subtle patterns in the auroras, explaining how Verdani scholars interpreted them as messages from quantum currents far beyond ordinary perception. Marcus listened, attempting to follow, occasionally nodding at points he half understood, all the while marveling at how effortlessly she could blend grandeur with charm, power with playfulness. A sudden misfire from a nearby comm relay sent a brief static pulse across the observation panel, producing a flicker of light that cast playful shadows across the room. The Queen laughed at the visual, and Marcus, in a moment of boldness, quipped, "I assure you, these are only semi-controlled phenomena." She tilted her head, one ear twitching inquisitively, and replied, "It suits your environment." Charming, in a haphazard way. By the time she rose to leave, the room felt warmer, lighter, as though their laughter and conversation had displaced the oppressive hum of the station's machinery. Marcus, who had spent the day oscillating between terror and exhilaration, realized he felt something new. A tentative sense of ease, an inkling that interspecies encounters, even with a sovereign, could be rich with amusement and subtle connection. The Queen paused at the door, her eyes meeting his with a faint smile, and Marcus could swear the room itself seemed to pulse with expectation. "Tomorrow," she said softly, almost teasingly, "we shall continue our discussion. There is much to learn, and perhaps more amusement to uncover." Marcus nodded, too flustered to respond coherently, and as the door closed, he leaned against the wall, laughing quietly at the absurdity of the day. The station hummed around him, indifferent yet somehow approving, and for the first time, he felt that he might survive his interactions with the Queen without further public humiliation. Perhaps. But he knew, deep down, that the universe had other plans, and that somewhere beyond the corridors and force fields, the threads of curiosity, fascination, and laughter were already weaving a tangled orbit between them, one that would inevitably bring them into ever closer, and often ridiculously awkward, proximity. The next morning, Marcus awoke with a mixture of anticipation and dread, a sensation that had become his constant companion since the Queen's first whispered promise. He had spent the previous night rehearsing everything. Casual conversation, formal greetings, even a few witty interjections he hoped would charm her. By the time he stumbled out of his sleep-induced haze, he realized he had left his replicator running, producing an unnecessary stack of nutrient bars that now teetered precariously on his bedside table. He sighed, trying not to imagine the Queen walking in on this minor disaster, and muttered to himself, "First impressions matter, Marcus. First impressions matter, even if the station thinks otherwise." Breakfast was a careful negotiation with the replicator and his nerves. He poured a synthetic coffee, only to spill half of it on the counter, and curse it under his breath when a small cleaning bot swiveled its sensors in his direction, as if silently judging him. At least he hoped it was judging him. One could never be entirely certain with autonomous machines designed to be both helpful and unsettlingly precise. As he carried the tray toward the observation deck, he thought about the green skin glimmering faintly in the soft light, long ears twitching like sensors calibrated to subtle nuance, blonde hair catching the reflection of the artificial sun. The image made his chest tighten in a strange mixture of excitement and terror, and he realized he had memorized every detail of her face in a way that was almost unhealthy. By mid-morning, a subtle announcement rippled across the station's intercom. The Queen was arriving again, this time without the official entourage, which meant Marcus would have the room to himself with her. He adjusted his posture for what felt like the 100th time that week, ensuring he looked competent rather than a human-shaped disaster waiting to happen. Of course, as he opened the door to greet her, he tripped over the edge of the rug, catching himself only with a graceless tumble into a chair. She raised a delicately arched eyebrow, long ears flicking, and let out a soft laugh that made him feel simultaneously foolish and electrified. "Good morning, Lieutenant Vale," she said, her voice smooth, melodic, yet carrying the subtle weight of amusement. "You seem vigorous." Marcus straightened, muttering, "I assure you, it's purely intentional." He internally cursed himself for the obviousness of the lie, but she only smiled, a faint curve that hinted she had long since learned the gap between Terran nervousness and deliberate action. The morning passed with a gentle rhythm of conversation, punctuated by small humor and human folly. Marcus recounted more stories of his misadventures with gravity stabilizers and misbehaving bots, exaggerating just enough to produce genuine laughter from her. She, in turn, shared tales of Verdani scholars attempting practical jokes with quantum illusions, resulting in rooms full of holographic cats floating midair, while the culprits tried to maintain composure. Marcus nearly choked on his synthetic coffee at the image of dignified alien elders chasing spectral felines, and she laughed at the absurdity of his reaction, long ears flicking in delight. The bond between them was growing, subtle yet undeniable, built not on protocol but on shared amusement and mutual curiosity. By afternoon, the humor gave way to deeper conversation. They sat near the observation deck, watching the spiral of gas giants below, and she spoke of the immense responsibilities of rulership. The weight of decisions that could affect entire star systems, the subtle politics that required a combination of grace and calculation, and the loneliness that often accompanied power. Marcus listened, fascinated and empathetic, and began sharing his own small, human frustrations, not with cosmic consequence, but with the limitations of life aboard a station, the absurdities of bureaucracy, the occasional despair at the stubbornness of a coffee machine. The Queen nodded thoughtfully, showing genuine interest in his perspective, and Marcus realized that this alien sovereign, with her glowing green skin and golden hair, was capable of both immense power and profound understanding. In a sudden, playful moment, he gestured toward a small gravity-modulated device he had been tinkering with. "Watch this," he said, activating it, sending a tiny cluster of objects floating upward in slow, whimsical arcs. One metallic cube pirouetted and collided softly with the corner of a chair, causing a miniature cascade that reminded Marcus a little too much of the first day she had arrived. He braced for admonishment, but instead she laughed, the sound clear and musical, and flicked her ears in what he could only interpret as approval. "Ingenious," she said, "and delightfully chaotic." The relief that washed over him was nearly as profound as the thrill of her praise. As evening descended on the station, the lighting softened, casting long shadows across the observation deck. Marcus found himself standing closer to her, drawn by a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and the faint thrill of danger that came from proximity to someone so immensely powerful. She leaned forward slightly, studying a pattern in the swirling planetary clouds, and he realized with a jolt that he was no longer merely the nervous human officer who had tripped over a hollow projector. He had grown. His confidence, fragile though it still was, had begun to solidify through the absurdity, laughter, and shared experiences of the previous encounters. He could engage, banter, even tease, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but always with an underlying awareness of his own humanity and the warmth of her attentiveness. Then a minor crisis, a sudden fluctuation in the station's gravity field, threatened to turn their sitting area into a temporary zero-gravity arena. Objects floated, manuals and cups drifting lazily upward, and Marcus instinctively lunged to stabilize the devices. The Queen, far from alarmed, simply flicked her ears and waved her hand, subtly manipulating the energy around them to restore equilibrium. The humor of the moment struck him. Here was the most powerful figure he had ever known, using her abilities to prevent a minor slapstick catastrophe, and he was both relieved and slightly mortified that he had been caught mid-dramatic dive to save a floating coffee cup. She laughed softly at his expression, and he bowed, mock solemnly, acknowledging his own ridiculousness. Night fell fully, and the two of them settled near the observation deck once again. The station was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the energy conduits and the occasional beep of maintenance bots patrolling the corridors. Marcus realized that the absurdity, the laughter, the shared curiosity, all of it, had transformed into something quieter, deeper, a delicate intimacy that didn't require words to confirm. He had learned to balance his fears with humor, his awe with conversation, and his nervous energy with genuine connection. "I never thought I'd find humor in the complexities of an orbital station," the Queen said softly, her voice almost conspiratorial. "Yet here we are." Her long ears twitched attentively, and her green eyes glimmered with warmth. Marcus smiled, realizing that he was no longer the same man who had tripped over his own rug at her first arrival. He had grown into someone who could meet her presence with confidence, still human, still clumsy, but capable of laughter, empathy, and curiosity. He gestured toward the view of the planets below, and they watched in companionable silence. Occasionally, a small flicker of light from the distant station modules would reflect across her hair, catching the golden strands in a way that seemed almost magical. Marcus, for all his scientific mind, felt something unquantifiable, something that could not be measured in sensors or logs, expand quietly within him. Humor, curiosity, and a subtle affection had woven themselves together, forming an orbit neither of them could fully explain, yet both recognized as vital. Before leaving, she placed a delicate hand on his shoulder, her long fingers brushing the fabric of his uniform. "Tomorrow," she said, voice low, teasing, "we shall continue our discussions, perhaps with fewer gravity anomalies." She gave him a small, almost human smile, and Marcus felt a thrill of anticipation for the future. He realized that he had been changed, not merely by her presence, but by the way he had learned to engage with it. With openness, with laughter, and with the courage to exist honestly in the face of something extraordinary. When she departed, leaving the quiet hum of the station behind, Marcus leaned against the observation console and exhaled. The room was still a mess of minor disarray, floating manuals and loose tools, but for the first time, he didn't mind. The chaos now felt like a part of the rhythm of life aboard Aurelia 7, a rhythm that included laughter, connection, and the subtle magic of being seen and understood. He smiled at the thought of tomorrow, of further shared discoveries, and of the improbable, delightful companionship he had found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The station continued its orbit, silent and indifferent, yet beneath the low hum of its machinery, a faint resonance lingered, an echo of humor, of curiosity, and of a human and an alien who had found something extraordinary in each other, small but unshakable, orbiting together in a vast universe that had, at last, begun to feel a little less lonely. Marcus, finally, allowed himself to laugh quietly, the sound soft and genuine, as he realized he had emerged not only unscathed but transformed, capable of facing the unknown with courage, humor, and a spark of wonder that would stay with him far beyond this night. The absurdities, the minor mishaps, the laughter, and the tentative, tender connection, all of it had coalesced into something enduring. Marcus understood now that growth came not from perfection, but from embracing chaos, curiosity, and companionship, even when the universe seemed determined to test both. And as he watched the swirling planets, the light reflected, the station continued its orbit, silent and indifferent, yet beneath the low hum of its machinery, a faint resonance lingered, an echo of humor, of curiosity, and of a human and an alien who had found something extraordinary in each other, small but unshakable, orbiting together in a vast universe that had, at last, begun to feel a little less lonely. Marcus, finally, allowed himself to laugh quietly, the sound soft and genuine, as he realized he had emerged not only unscathed but transformed, capable of facing the unknown with courage, humor, and a spark of wonder that would stay with him far beyond this night. The absurdities, the minor mishaps, the laughter, and the tentative, tender connection, all of it had coalesced into something enduring. Marcus understood now that growth came not from perfection, but from embracing chaos, curiosity, and companionship, even when the universe seemed determined to test both. And as he watched the swirling planets, the light reflecting off the observation panels, and the faint glow of distant stars, he felt a profound sense of closure, of completion, and of the quiet, extraordinary magic